recent videos, we've been discussing the phenomenon of 19th century imperialism, the period in which Europe extended its control over Africa and Asia using non-traditional forms of imperial expansion. What I mean by this is that, by and large, these European countries didn't pick up and move populations to settlements in Africa and Asia to establish what we might define as colonies. Rather, these European countries used economic exploitation and investment to establish control over African populations and Asian populations so that they could extract benefits from these so-called special relationships. What we want to do in this video is to take a look at some of the justifications and causes of this so-called new imperialism, to explore the various dimensions involved in the expansion of Europe in the 19th century. So we start with the underpinnings of the imperial race, which are oftentimes referred to by the phrase God, gold, and glory. For a long time, the middle part of that phrase was understood to be the most significant, the gold part. What this suggested is that 19th century European imperialism was rooted first and foremost in economic justifications or in economic policy. This is a suggestion that Africa and Asia represented territories that were rich in natural resources and that were untapped markets for European goods. So this was a way of expanding the Second Industrial Revolution, and more specifically, the products of the Second Industrial Revolution, into new territories in order to increase profit for European factory owners. In the midst of an economic downturn in the 1870s, tariffs, cartels, and other protectionist measures led European powers to enter into a period of sort of conflict as they all looked for new markets and new resources. And many argue that these new African and Asian markets provided the foundation of the modern economic world. J.A. Hobson, for example, has suggested that British businessmen determined imperial policy, and soldiers and missionaries just helped out. And in many ways, the colonies in Africa and Asia did provide sources for natural resources such as diamond, gold, rubber, cocoa. And they did offer new markets. And so in that sense, this economic justification for imperialism fits well with the world systems theory that we've been discussing in this course. In some cases, like the British in Egypt, it's quite true. There was a tremendous amount of conflict for control over the Suez Canal, and most of that was economically driven. But in other cases, like French control over the Sahara Desert, for example, the economic justification doesn't necessarily hold up. There weren't a tremendous number of resources or markets available in the Sahara Desert. So why were the French so interested? Moreover, much of European trade was still directed in the 19th century at the Atlantic world, trading with the Americas, rather than focusing on Africa and Asia. And large parts of the African continent weren't suitable for economic development. So the economic returns weren't as great as the colonial lobbies promised. And yet imperialism in Africa and Asia during the late 19th century continued largely unchecked. So why was that? There have to be other non-economic factors involved. So what we're going to do today is to take a look at some of those, starting with the concept of new nationalism. Mass politics and the expansion of the electorate in the late 19th century had created a new kind of nationalism. Early 19th century nationalism was organized around the idea that people who shared a common language, common history, common background, and common heritage should be organized into a nation state. rather than having nations' boundaries defined by things like inheritance or war or marriage, as it had traditionally been the case in the medieval and early modern periods. So this nationalism was a push for nation states. New nationalism, as it developed in the late 19th century, was increasingly anti-democratic and associated with the far right, and more or less resulted in this almost fanatical loyalty to one's nation, and to a belief that one's nation was the best and most deserving nation in the world. This is called jingoism, which is defined as the swaggering self-assurance of nationalists committed to expanding the power of their nation at the expense of others, because their nation included the most gifted and blessed and therefore deserving people in the world. This was a sense that Europeans could and should expand their power throughout the globe as a way of increasing the power of their nation. It was, in other words, a patriotic venture. Imperialism, then, was in some ways just the extension of competition between European powers for security and power on the European continent. In this way, Africa and Asia became part of a chess match in which various European powers competed for authority. They competed for power, not necessarily over the African or Asian territories, but vis-a-vis other European powers. Another of the dominant characteristics or underpinnings of this new imperial race in the 19th century was racism. Europeans assumed that non-Europeans were inferior to them. We referred to this earlier as the one-other split, the psychological process whereby people divide the world into us and them, or one and other. It's the result of intense tribalism, which is a way of maintaining loyalty. In the case of Africa and Asia, this was the racist sense that many Europeans had, that Europeans were superior to non-Europeans. So that people in Africa and Asia were some sort of foreign other that could be conquered and controlled, because this otherness coincided with inferiority. This racism was rooted in a pseudoscientific justification known as social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, as elaborated by Herbert Spencer, used Darwin's theory of evolution to argue that some civilizations, namely Western civilizations, were more evolved and hence superior to other civilizations. Darwin argued that natural selection had allowed for certain stronger or better adapted species to survive at the expense of other species. This was applied by social scientists like Herbert Spencer to human societies, arguing that civilizations and cultures, groups of people, are in a competition for a finite set of resources, and that certain groups, certain societies, are better adapted or better suited to winning that competition for resources than others. The argument then was that they were that societies were locked into a struggle that was based on the idea of the survival of the fittest. In other words, the society that won because they were naturally selected to win, because they were superior in some way. And so the advantages that Europe had, industrialization, early industrial weaponry, wealth, the advantages that they had that allowed them to relatively easily conquer large parts of Africa and Asia were described by contemporary Europeans as just being the way things were, as being sort of this innate or natural superiority that Europeans had over non-Europeans. And so because Europeans could conquer Africa and Asia, they should, because that was the natural order of things. Another justification that Europeans used for conquering large parts of Africa and Asia was religion. Colonists insisted that God was on their side because it was their divine mission to civilize the barbarians. This became known as the mission to civilize, or what Frederick Lugard has called the dual mandate of imperialism. Because while imperialism was understood to benefit the mother country, the European country, it was also understood to benefit, at least in the long run, the colony. Europeans believed that the building of empire would result in a better quality of life for the native inhabitants of Africa or Asia. And that by association with European ways of life, European styles of education, European languages, these indigenous populations could become better Africans or better Chinese or better Indians. Images of the noble savage waiting to be freed from his captivity abounded in European literature. You can see it in poems like The White Man's Burden, or in ads like this one for Pear's soap, in which the first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pear's soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances, while amongst the cultured of all nations it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. So in this case, they were using the image of the white man's burden and the mission to civilize to sell soap. It became commercialized. So there were a number of non-economic factors involved in the European expansion in the 19th century into Africa and Asia. And so we can't just argue that new imperialism was rooted in economic factors driven by the Second Industrial Revolution, but instead we must understand that it was driven by other non-economic factors as well. Thank you.